thesatanictemple.com. Okay, the first from a page on their website, and the page is entitled Satanic Abortions Are Protected by Religious Liberty Laws. And the first section reads, in accordance with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, first trimester abortions are now exempt from unnecessary regulations for all individuals practicing the Satanic Temple's religious abortion ritual. On page 2, and it says a lot of things here, but on page 2 it goes on to say, it asks this question, how is the Satanic abortion ritual legally protected? And it says, as a federally recognized religion, the Satanic Temple utilizes RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the Hobby Lobby precedent to protect its members from unnecessary abortion regulations that inhibit their religious practices and force them to violate their deeply held beliefs. And then, also from that site, there is a regulation exemption letter that members of the Satanic Temple can download and use. And let me just read a brief portion of this. The subject is Demand for Religious Exemption to Abortion Restrictions. To whom it may concern, I am a pregnant person and a Satanist beginning the process of an abortion ritual. I am aware that state law implements generally applicable restrictions on abortions. However, state law also provides for religious exemptions to generally applicable rules which impose a substantial burden on religious beliefs or practices. This letter lays out my claim for a religious exemption to generally applicable restrictions on abortions. And it goes on to note several things, that this is my sincerely held religious belief, and I need to do this religious rite, R-I-T-E in that case, of the abortion. Now, I also have with me a recent story from World Magazine about religious freedom, specifically for animal sacrifices, and I think it deals mainly with Islam. But it ends with this line. I want to read this. It says, this story is relevant to Christians, so-and-so noted, because the same First Amendment rules that protect religious sacrifice also protect Christian foster care agencies and wedding vendors. First Amendment protections for different faiths stand or fall together. They stand or fall together. The event tonight, as you know, is called the cultus, or religion, of abortion, and it is certainly appropriate to label it that, as the act of child sacrifice is indeed a part of a religion. It's a part of a religious system. And the topic of my address is the freedom of religion fallacy, abortion and the freedom of religion fallacy. But the fallacy is not in the Satanists' use of the argument, but rather in the Christians' use of it. Now, I think Christians should use good argumentation. We have been tasked with taking over the world for Christ, Matthew 28. We have been told that Christians will indeed judge the world, 1 Corinthians 6. And we are to destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ, 2 Corinthians 10. I don't think we do that with bad arguments. Now, we are in a big mess here as it relates to abortion. And there's a lot that could be said and needs to be said. My talk is simply a brief call to biblical thinking as we seek to move ahead both in our generation and our children's generation and our grandchildren's generation. Now, I want to note that if you find this talk helpful and you'd like to share it, we have newspapers over there, the Lancaster Patriot, and my talk is a modified version of my editorial that was just printed. So if this is at all helpful to you, take some extra copies. If you would feel like sharing it, share them and subscribe to the paper if you're not a subscriber. So, what is the argument for religious freedom? Well, let's start with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. Here's what the act does. It prohibits the government from burdening, I'm going to read a part of the text now. It prohibits them from burdening a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability, except that the government may burden a person's exercise of religion only if it determines that application of the burden to the person, one, fulfills a compelling governmental interest, and two, is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest. So you can hear in there some of the language from the exemption letter that I read from the Satanic Temple. Now, what does that legal jargon mean? It essentially means this: Christ is not Lord, and the pagan state is God. Now, I have two main points to try to explain that. Number one, Christians should reject the freedom of religion fallacy. And number two, since we haven't, the pro-aborts have been happy to embrace it. And why wouldn't they? So, the freedom of religion fallacy. First of all, let me say there is no religious freedom in the Bible. And to understand that, we need to understand what religion even means. Religion is not merely a set of personal beliefs about the metaphysical reality around us. It's an intensely practical thing, and it impacts the here and the now. Thus, we see in the Bible, in many places in the Bible, the outworking of pagan religion. For example, adultery, child sacrifice, sodomy, and bestiality, in Leviticus 18, 20 through 23, for example. These are not mere theoretical beliefs. These are the religious practices of pagan religion. Now, maybe the Canaanites should have used the religious freedom argument with God. Hey, we're just exercising our freedom of religion over here in the land of Canaan. Now, if they tried that argument, for some reason it didn't work. God judged their iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Leviticus 18:25. Maybe if they had the ACLU in ancient Canaan, they could have put together a lawsuit, or at least an exemption letter, a demand for religious exemption to present to Joshua. It didn't work. It wouldn't have worked. Here's the problem, though, with this argument. Christians have accepted the idea that religion is a tiny part of life and does not impact all of life. If religion is only what goes on between my ears, then religious freedom would make sense. But religion is more than that, and religious freedom does not make sense. Now, the adherents of the abortion religion are prone to talk about how our nation was built on the idea of religious freedom. But it wasn't, at least not in the way they think of it. The religious toleration of early American history was a concept that arose within Christendom and had reference to denominational differences among followers of Christ. The concept of the Christian conscience is a biblical doctrine, and it synthesizes well with the idea that the state should only punish what the Bible authorizes it to punish. But there was no freedom to practice whatever religion you wanted, and certainly not in whatever way you wanted. The New England Puritans did not allow public blasphemy, and William Penn's colony of Pennsylvania, the great example of religious toleration, outlawed not only the pagan religious practices of sodomy, bestiality, and adultery, but also outlawed blasphemy against the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, even into the 19th century, well into an era of Enlightenment America, laws were still being enforced against blasphemy. In 1810, a New York Supreme Judge affirmed the conviction of a man who had blasphemed and disparaged the name of Christ. His name was Chief Justice Kent, and he said this. See how this jives with religious freedom. The people of this state, in common with the people of this country, profess the general doctrines of Christianity as the rule of their faith and practice. And to scandalize the author of these doctrines is not only, in a religious point of view, extremely impious, but even in respect to the obligations due to society, a gross violation of decency and good order. Now, it seems like old Judge Kent there needs some remedial training on religious freedom from the modern experts. Or does he? I would submit that Kent had a better understanding of religion than most evangelical leaders do today. The state is not authorized to punish you for what you believe. This is true, and this is important. But the sword of the state is indeed to be wielded against certain public religious practices, including flagrant and open blasphemy or idolatry, and specifically, regarding the subject tonight, child sacrifice. So what is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act really saying? What is the argument that Christians have been apt to lean on? The same argument being used by many Christians now in the war over marriage. What is that argument that they're using? It is the argument that humanistic law is supreme, and we will feign to allow you to do your Christian thing over there, but only until it comes into conflict with the pagan god of the state. It's easy to see where that will lead. More and more conflicts with the pagan god of the state, and less so-called freedom, at least for Christians. Now, how do we get to the place where we are using these arguments as Christians? It is assumed now that the argument we should use against sodomy and the attempted destruction of marriage is the religious freedom argument. Well, at least let's have our religious freedom. You hear it all the time. I just got another email regarding the Disrespect for Marriage Act, and you have people claiming, well, at least this is a win because it contained some religious liberty clauses. What in the world are we doing? How did we get here? Now, we got here at least in part because Christians were happy to relegate the entire civil sphere to the pagans as long as they left us a tiny little place over here for our religion. If you aim low, it's hard to miss, right? But Christ didn't instruct us to aim low. He instructed us to disciple the nations, and Christians should never have negotiated with spiritual terrorists armed with the suicide vests of pagan law. So, Christians should have rejected the argument in 1993, and we should reject it today. The freedom of religion fallacy is erroneous because it posits something other than Christ as the highest authority in the land. We are going to argue as Christians that the pagan government ought to grant us the freedom to obey the Lord of glory in the same way they ought to grant the Muslim or Buddhist or Mormon the freedom to obey their false god? That does not sound like the destroying of arguments the Apostle Paul had in mind. And nor does it sound like preaching the gospel, which, if I recall, is that Jesus is Lord. But the Christian church largely embraced the blasphemous beast of freedom of religion, and now pro-aborts are quite happy to do so as well, and quite happy that we did. And they are right to use the freedom of religion argument. Any argument, any mechanism, any scheme which subjugates the lordship of Christ under pagan law is going to be used by the pagans. We should expect them to raise up these arguments against Christ. We just shouldn't expect the Christian church to help them. So here's the question. Does the freedom of religion grant someone the right to practice child sacrifice? According to the text of the Act, it sort of does. Or at least it doesn't write it off. Why? Because the authority in that text is not the true religion. The authority is not Christ and his law. The authority is who? Listen to this again. The government may burden a person's exercise of religion only if it demonstrates that application of the burden to the person furthers a compelling governmental interest. A compelling governmental interest. There it is. That's the pagan pay dirt. If Christians can use the freedom of religion argument to broker a deal with the Lord of the state, with pagan Caesar, why can't Satan worshipers do the same? And that is just what they are doing in New Mexico, as I read. Abortion is part of their religious rituals, and they claim they should have the right to practice their religion. And their main argument, piggybacking off of the Christian Hobby Lobby case, is religious freedom. Now, I'm not a fan of any governmental acts. We already have God's law. We should apply that. The only acts I like are found in between John and Romans. But if we are to have an act for this issue, it should have been the Freedom of the Pagan Conscience Act of 1993. And it should have read thus: the civil government shall not burden a person's exercise of their pagan religion unless such religious acts violate God's law applied in the civil sphere, revealed in the Old and New Testament, and the lordship of the rightful sovereign of the state, Jesus Christ. Now, what's the difference between those two acts? One is subjecting Christ to all things. The other is subjecting all things to Christ. One is saying that Christianity can be a tiny part of paganism. The other one is saying your pagan religion can be a very, very tiny part of Christendom. In summary, the pagans are correct to use the religious freedom argument for abortion. They are correct. The real problem is that the Christians have embraced the argument rather than obeying 2 Corinthians 10:5 and destroying it. We have contented ourselves with a little tiny part of this world when Christ told us to do the opposite. And now we are beholding the fruit of Enlightenment pluralism and pietistic Christianity. Babies being butchered in the name of the freedom of religion. What were Christians hoping to accomplish by making sure that at least we can have our little private religion over here? What has our coveted religious freedom accomplished for us? And what about our neighbor? If Christ is Lord, then serve him. If Moloch is God, then serve him. But let's have none of this freedom of religion nonsense. It is a ruse, a con, and a sham. The freedom of religion argument is a bad argument, and the pagans know it. They mock the Christian religion and laugh at our retreatism as we fight to maintain the freedom to not bake a cake for perverts or not perform a ceremony for two sodomites, while granting to them the premise that the Christian religion should only exist as a small exception to the state religion. This is a bad argument. The claims of Christ are not to be relegated to a little area of society labeled religious freedom, right up there on the shelf alongside the claims of Muhammad, Buddha, and Joseph Smith. As Psalm 2 reminds us, Christ is not overly interested in the freedom of religion when it comes to the kings of the earth. Rather, he is interested in calling on them to serve him fully, lest his wrath is quickly kindled and they perish in the way. And I submit that we and our children's generation need to follow the Lord in every area of life, including the arguments we are going to use and the arguments that we need to destroy. Thank you for your attention.